Welcome to All Things Africa, the podcast. Listen in as Levy, Mike, and Linda discuss socio-political and economic current events and how they affect Africans worldwide.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. So I think you'll find today's discussion interesting. We had a conversation about parenting by parents, for non-parents, and parents too. And it's pretty much taken from the angle of parenting as an African in the diaspora. So yeah, take a listen. I think you'll enjoy it. With everything that is going on in America, one of the things that is kind of dominating mainstream culture is the challenges that and everything that comes with being Black in America. And I was wondering, which is something I've never really asked any of my friends who are parents, how does that affect the way you parent? Does it affect the way you parent? The fact that you have children here in America, society is likely to look at them as Black American or just Black rather than African, or the identity that you saw yourself with when you were growing up. So has that affected in any way how you parent? And if it has, how has that affected your parenting?
Well, I can go. I think reflecting for me, I was raised partially here in the U.S. So, my first inkling is to reflect back on my own upbringing in the U.S.
Mm.
and mostly like middle school and high school in the U.S. And when it comes to being Black in America, what that means, you know, being being an African in America and having African American friends. And while growing up, I definitely saw a difference. Number one, first I was drawn to them because they were Black like me. Um, but for me, I quickly found that there's some slight differences in how, one, I was perceived as an African to African Americans, um, but two, that their long history, once I learned about it, because it took a while, because the American system is just not very forthcoming about slavery and the history of African Americans in America, and why there's somewhat of a disconnect. Some of them felt like, because I was in certain classes, that I was just favored because I'm African versus them being African American. And so I struggled at first because there was this constant invisible divide that was trying to happen between Africans and African Americans. And I would even find, like, the few Africans in the schools, the Nigerians or other Kenyans that I would meet, we try to stick together, but we knew that we can't really flourish in this environment by just gripping to each other. Because, like, you needed to interact with others. And so a lot of us, we were also trying to avoid each other. Because it's like you don't want to become like the Africans together,
Yeah, yeah.
and then because then you get this whatever stereotype goes with that comes with it. And so we were always trying to disperse each other and then kind of secretly, like, do little handshakes or whatever. And then what I found is, we had to engage in the activities that everybody else had to, but there was some level of, like, I can't show you who I really am, because, one, I feel like it's not accepted. Or two, it comes with too many questions that I don't really want to answer, and I'm always trying to hide from where I'm from. And meanwhile, you have parents, as soon as you get home, they're like, why are you trying to speak English at home? And like, you come back to full culture. And so living like this huge change of cultures constantly, when you're at home, you're in one culture, you get to school, it's time to shift. You're shifting gears all the time. And I think it has built some kind of strong resiliency in us and adaptability. But at the same time, it makes it hard because you want to assimilate, but you also want to have some originality. And when I think back about those experiences, I think about how do I give my kids the best of both, but not the worst of both, at the same time. So it's like, it's really something else. And now, growing up, we always had, like, when it comes to Black issues in America, we always had, instructions like, oh, behave a certain way, or once we were driving, be respectful to the officer and all that. But like, we weren't like clearly afraid for our lives, in that way. And that might have to do more with where we live. If I grew up in a city that violent crimes were happening from the police all the time, maybe I feel differently. But, you know, growing up mostly in the South and in Florida, which really isn't the South, even though it's in the South, the experience is different. And so for us, it was about respecting police or whatever. But as we got older, we'd hear about the brutality, remembering Rodney King riots after what happened to him, seeing it a little bit on TV here and there was interesting. And of course, we got desensitized ourselves to having negative images of Black people. Anytime a crime happened or something like that happened, they would immediately talk about how this person was a gangbanger or they did drugs or whatever. And so you get used to it, like, okay, well, I'm not those things, so I should be okay. And then nowadays, it's like, even somebody like Brianna, who was an EMT or someone that worked in the, you know, in that field, but still their life was in danger, and they got killed. Or, people that are legal gun carriers don't get the same respect. You start to see that it has nothing to do with how you behave, but more to do with the other person's perception of who you are, period. And so for me, it's changed drastically what it means to raise children in America, because I think, for one, I'm not as ignorantly bliss as I was before. Now you realize it seems to not matter so much what you do. You're still going to tell your kids to behave a certain way when they're encountering police, but more importantly, it's like, we got to do more to change those behaviors than just tell our kids how to comply, because clearly complying is not it's not the answer. It's not working. So thinking about raising my children to be who they are, but also I feel like I need to get more involved in how to change things locally, and even in the nation, when it comes to how they perceive my children.
Well, I guess Linda started with her explaining that she was raised here, but I came here at 24, so I was raised in Kenya. And so me, that sense of being African, depending on what that means to me, and it's something I've been exploring quite a bit. And I found it's very difficult to pin it down in one sense. There is no one way of being African. That's what I've concluded. I even explored the idea of whether there is an essence, and that's even still one that's difficult. If you say the essence is that Africans are more communal than individual, you'll still find communal people in the US like the Amish. So it stops being that, and you still find that maybe the conclusion is that the identity itself is not so essential. It's not so grounded in the sense that it can be one. And maybe starting from that is me wondering then to that question, how do I then, my preference would be to raise them as African, right? But what does that even mean, first of all? Like, I have to explore that, and not finding that in a very solid sense then made me think, okay, what does it then mean to be African American? Because then you hear African American, and I think there's a geographical or spatial sense there, the idea that you belong in Africa, like you are part of an African society or place called Africa. So in the sense, if my children were born here, both of them, then they are African American in the sense that they're not just Black, but they're African American, in the sense they are both American and they're also African. And maybe there is a fusion there that I have to grapple with in terms of what is it that I would present to them as a parent that they could actually socialize within, and have to make sense of what this means when they say they're African American, because in a true sense they really are, because I'm African, their mom is American, she's mixed race, both black and white, so they have all these identities to navigate. So then I ended up with what you asked, Mike, black, which to some extent can be more universal, especially if you think about the Biko's idea of a black consciousness that's more universal from an action standpoint, which is where I am exploring now. And so it does mean for me means many things, and I think it depends on also how I engage with the idea of blackness and what it means to be black, because even in that sense, you don't find one essential idea of blackness. Maybe going back to the civil rights era, the protests, maybe there was one sense, but now there's all different varieties of what it would mean to be black. And so even that means that I can't introduce it to them or raise my kids in a way that confines them, where they can't explore these different varieties of what it means to be black. So I could be intentional about it and say, okay, I don't want them to stumble upon the idea of what being black means. I could actually make it an intentional effort to explain, but also characterize and behave in ways that show them what blackness is. Or I could, for instance, be black, like behave black, like what that would mean to me. Like everything I do is defined by my perspective on blackness and black consciousness, my music, my dressing, the people I associate with, my actions, my social justice, to the point they are kind of a little bit exhausted to some extent. You can exhaust them if that's all you're doing. So there's a spectrum there where there's the accidental, they stumble on it, or where I'm so intentional to the point of, the Malcolm X sense. I am black. You have to do everything black. Everything is black in this house. We are hanging nothing but black things in this house. Music is black. Everything is black. So I'm in that zone where I'm exploring where do I fall in the spectrum. But I feel like as a parent, I feel like I want them to explore more on their own, because I think in terms of the future, and I think things will keep changing, and it's better for them to be able to expose to these different ways of being black, but also for them to be able to explore once they become teenagers and not feel like they are bound in one, but at least they should be able to make sense of who I am and who I was. So at a subconscious level, they can be able to relate to, this is what my father likes to do, or he likes to do, this is how he behaves. And they can be able to have some basis to question what they want to be as they explore their own identity. Because with kids, their identity really forms later when they're teenagers, when they begin to really look for their own identity, that period of adolescence to adult. But if they don't have a clear, solid grounding, I feel like I have a role in the place where they have to navigate being African, African American, and black, to figure out what that means for them at some point, whether it's at a subconscious or a conscious level.
And it's interesting that I like many of the things that you're saying. And one of the things that's, just to pick up on what Linda said, one of the things that whether you came here in high school or came here in college as an African, I think many of us don't fully appreciate how much desensitized we are to the experience of Black Americans, especially given their history as Africans coming here today, right? So, and what I see, that how I see it playing out for parents, is that a lot of the parents that I meet tend to try and replicate, like what you were saying, Linda, kind of banding together as African students, right? You're trying to find unity there, which makes sense, but also you're in America, so you need to also explore and make different types of connections and leverage those connections outside of your community. Sometimes I see a lot of parents trying to replicate an African style of parenting or an African home 100% here in America. Like they are just going with, this is how I was raised, and that's how I'm going to raise my kids here, right? So they almost try to take their parenting experience in Africa and then just kind of superimpose it into within the American experience, and expecting sort of the same outcome as they had, in their children. And I wonder if you feel like, what do you think about that formula?
Yeah.
And what do you think the differences are if any, between if you were parenting in Africa or and parenting here?
I think I like that point that you're, and you're speaking to me in some sense, because at some point I wanted to create an African community of Africans who understand what that means, which is very difficult to pin it down because some of these identities can be illusions to be honest. And those illusions can be something that actually bind us as much as they're illusions for good or bad reasons, right? And so even thinking about having that community, which is still good to have, even if it's illusions, but it's important to acknowledge that they are illusions in some sense, because some of them, even the idea that Africa is such a big place with all these cultures and ways of living and ways of experiencing, it's almost a disservice to really narrow it down to say this is an African community with an African sense of African culture. But I think one point you made, which is important, is as a parent realizing the dangers of projecting to your child, right? Projecting to your child a sense that they have to live in and that this is who they should become, and because you're so committed to it that you don't want to journey with them in their exploration. And so I find that it's important, at least for me as a parent, not to project what I'm still grappling with, first of all. But I find that I want to journey with them, because I think as an African who is still doing what you're trying to do to sensitize myself to the Black American experience, I am in the journey as much as they're in the journey. So I'm more sort of nowadays thinking that you could have all three, where you have your African community and you bind yourselves around certain um, ideas, but you could also sort of avoid projecting that to your child, in a sense that they don't have room to explore in a context where they are living a new world. But also, while you're doing that, I think journeying with them, which is sort of important, because they are like my son who's in kindergarten. He hangs out with, like Linda was saying, she hang out with other African American kids, and she needs to have that space to explore what that means. And from that, maybe my job is to be in tune with what she has learned or he has learned from that experience. Like in Linda's experience, I would have said, okay, I want to be in tune with what you're learning from this experience so that I understand what this means for you and for me as we journey through this and figure out. So that's my sense, is that that spectrum of bounding in a community and identifying what that means and trying to introduce your child to that, but not projecting it to the point they can't explore, and also being able to journey with them and being in tune with what they're experiencing and what they're becoming, or what how they explain things for themselves.
I think this is really interesting because I feel like there's a need to, for myself, like you're saying, Levy, we're still figuring out what it means to be African, right? Because it's like African culturally, I mean, ethnicity wise, we're African, right? But culture wise, it's like, for me, it's a mashup, right? Because like I have a lot of American culture or cultural behaviors as well as African cultural behaviors. But like, if I go to Americans, they're like, oh, you're very American. If I go to Africans, they're like, oh, you're very American. So it's like, what does that mean though? Because they change it constantly. And so like what they expect an African to be, nobody can really define it, right? So like even with my mom or my uncles or my aunts, if I'm talking to them and they're just like, you're so American, it could be because of the food that I like, it could be the way I like to dress, or the way I decorate my house. Like it has so many different variations of what it means to be African or not African, that it's a struggle. Because like I agree with you, Levy, that we're gonna have to like just kind of walk with our kids on this, because while like my son Sammy, he's very proud that he's from South Sudan. He tells his teachers he's from South Sudan. My dad is South Sudanese. He speaks the language very well. My mom doesn't, and all this stuff, and he's already trying to figure out his identity, and I'm sure that's just going to evolve on so many levels, because for me, it evolved when it came to marriage. It evolved when it meant talking about children and how many children and what's acceptable and what's the time frame for children. children, and like it's like the definition of what it means to be African keeps changing. And I feel like we create a concrete definition of what it means to be African American just because they've been here longer, and it's or because of their history. And I feel like it's so unfair because I feel very, very judged by my African family, about me being African enough or not. I can only imagine for my children who are being completely raised here versus for me, I was kind of raised in both places, how that definition and perception is going to continue to change. Like, how do I even raise them that way? I think for me, it's more important that I'm raising them to understand how those outside perspectives can impact them, and how they can either minimize the impact on themselves or embrace some components and reject others, but it's hard. It's a really hard question to answer.
I guess part of this is that, is sort of a recognition that it's not a black and white sort of predictive process.
Yeah.
And, it's a evolving kind of feel your way through, right? But so I wonder generally, right, the way I think of it, right? So, or anything, you're feeling your way through, you're evolving, but you generally have some kind of true north, right, that you're working towards. And what are the features, right, of your experience growing up, or the values that you saw in your parents, values you saw in your grandparents? What are you grabbing from that heritage, whatever you are navigating around being African, that is helping you shape your true north in terms of, your parenting and the compass, the direction you want to give to your kids? What's in that formula, or, for the true north?
When I was growing up, and I think this was where I was talking about being able to search for identity from a grounded point, right? So it's important to be grounded as you search for identity. And I think it's also important for kids that it's good to explore, but have some groundedness in finding out what is it you want. Otherwise, you get into identity crisis quickly, and life becomes very challenging because you have this crisis and you don't have a center to go back to. So for me, at least, growing up, I think some of the values, as you pointed out, the main ones, which I find that are very universal now, more than just African, the idea of community and family, the idea of supporting family and living for more than just yourself, that you are not so important as your family and your community is. When I was growing up, for example, I think when I do, reflection, I realized that my mom, throughout my childhood, had relatives and strangers in the house, and the house was full always. Like, we were 7 in the family, but most of the time we were like 15, 16 people in the house. And that's my memory of how we grew up. We shared a little room with 6 people, and girls shared their room, and the house was filled to the kitchen, to the living room. Every space was filled up. I don't remember a time ever my mom turning down someone who showed up abruptly and said, "I'm here and I've arrived," and my mom didn't say, "Okay, you gotta go back because you're not staying here without a notice." And they would stay, there was not like I'm staying for a week. It was more like I'm just staying. And and sometimes they didn't have to announce that. It was just understood.
It was
Yes.
like first it would start innocently, like to just come for tea.
Oh, I'm just
Yeah.
here for a
Yeah,
week.
this is really tea. And the tea would turn into the night would turn into the week.
Months
And then
months, and
all of a
that's it.
sudden they're sitting down making decisions with the family. Like,
With
no,
the
I don't
family.
think we should do that. I think we should do that.
So that sense of community, family, living for each other, supporting each other, taking care of each other. I think even when I think about things like what's the role of government, and who should I vote for, and who should I support, those kinds of questions drive a lot of how I think my humanity can be expressed. And so even if I'm finding different things here and there, and mixing and creating this collage or this mixture of everything, I still find that those values of community and family are important. But I also think that relationships, the way we relate to parents and the way we relate to elders is different. And to some extent, I still think that even for me and my children, there should be some respectful way of introducing those kinds of values without suffocating too much the idea of respect, the idea of listening to your adults and elders. And I'm sure it's here too, but I think that that's important. And I think, Linda, all of you know that when you're in your elders, there's a way you behave that's pretty standard. There's a routine, there's a procedure, there are practices you do and you don't do. And there's a way of maintaining order that's just the way it is. And that's how the way it is. And you maintain order, and the family and everything and traditions stay the way they are. And I think that's important. And I think that there's value in that, and that value shouldn't be lost, even if I introduce my children to individualism. Because even the idea of exploring is an individualistic idea. The idea you go explore, find who you are. Because when we were growing up, you were told who you are.
Yes, you were.
You were told what you should do. You were told, and even today you are told what you should do and all these things. And even I'm an adult, have kids, but I still am told by my parents what I should do, and I respect that. And still, even the irony is that I want my kids to explore, but I still have to respect that, and I have to figure out how those essential things that I still found created some kind of order in community, in family, in growing up was so important. And I want to still capture that and make sure it doesn't go away.
Yes, I agree. I think it's important to give them the balance of what it means to be a part of a collective society, but also have some individual pursuits. If I was to add anything to what you said, it would be, when it comes to raising them on this side of the world, in America, I would, want them to feel comfortable being Black, right? Like the idea, Black is beautiful. I want you to love being Black and not have anyone deter that from you. And that's something I want to instill in my children first. Number two would be, that they don't have to have the constraints that society puts on them, especially in America. Growing up African, you're always taught, especially all of us when it comes to school, you should be a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, these things. We aspire to great things, good professions, not that they can't choose anything else. But what I loved about that growing up as an African is that it reminded you that you can be those things, you can do those things. What I found in America when it comes to Black people, they try to push us towards certain things, right? They try to push us towards sports and music and these things. And I don't want them to feel like they have to do, those are their options. I even fight it when it comes to I'm very picky about basketball versus football, right? Because for me, football to me is like the barbaric sport that is just using your body up, right? This is just me. But basketball to me is a better sport because one, I feel like basketball players are more respected within their own field and being able, we see this very easily when all this race issues have come up. Basketball, the NBA, allows their people to have a voice. They have a voice when it comes to what happens within the NBA. When it comes to the NFL, it's like, just shut up and play. That's like two different worlds to me. But I want my children, one, to grow up not with these stereotypes of who they should be from American society, but I want them to feel free to explore whatever they want because they want to do that, not necessarily because that's what's being imposed upon them. When I listened to Michelle Obama's early years and being told she shouldn't even apply to Harvard because, they won't even consider her, she won't even get in, and she did. But if she heard what that person told her, who is an important person in the school, if she just followed their advice, she would have never applied. She would have never even tried to pursue anything. And I don't want, and I feel like that's been the case with a lot of people that I know that are African Americans or friends, that they just weren't given the same choice of who they could be, even mentally, And I think for me, raising my children with a mindset that they can be anything that they want to be, and it has nothing to do with their race. It has nothing to do with that, but more to do with their desire and their work ethic and their goals. And I think that is very important in America, because people will put you in boxes and they'll try to push you in that way.
Yeah, I think just briefly to add to that, Mike, I think it's that challenge that African parents face in terms of the internal world that their kids are growing up in, and the world that they will face out there when they're told what Africa is and who Africans are and how Africans behave. You know, sometimes I hear my son say things that I wonder, where did he get that from? You know, it's more like, oh, you know, we should why are the kids there so sick? Why are the kids? I'm already like, okay, I don't think I talked to him about this, but he's already talking about them being so sick and needing food, and he's already knowing that we are somewhat inferior in taking care of each other. You know, that those senses, I'm wondering where they're coming from, and that can be challenging to him associating to the idea of being African as a child. So I think even to build on Linda is what I tell him, or what I can tell him about Africa, that can change the narrative, so that he knows that there's an capable Africa, there's an Africa that's great, there's an Africa that actually can stand on its shoulders and things like that, so that he's going to be exposed to stereotypes. And he's going to look at me and say, are you African, Dad? Are you all these things also? And you know, it's more like, how should he know me as an African beyond the stereotypes?
Yeah.
How do I do it so that it's not something that I brainwash him, but introduce him to really something that's not going to stereotype me and make him not want to be called African? Maybe say, I'm black, I'm not African American, not African, I'm just black. You know, the idea that it's good to do that from a universal sense, but from a sense of denial can be dangerous for him, for me, for his family in Africa or in Kenya and all that.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, that's something we tackle every day in our language, because whenever we're talking about when my kids don't want to finish their food, and, you know, somebody will immediately say, you know, there's hungry kids. And I go, in America, you know, like there's hungry kids in America.
Absolutely.
There's hungry kids within our city. So let's not act like it's a foreign thing that happens only in Africa. No, we have food insecurity right here in America, and people need to know that. My kids don't need to grow up thinking that it's only African children that are hungry.
And speaking of that, sort of the impressions they get, another thing I've witnessed is African parents here really sort of almost fearful of what are the things that they're going to pick up from this American society that I don't want them to pick up, right? So you know, they're sometimes the way they approach parenting within an American context that is very different from what they experienced.
Yeah,
it's restrictive in a sense.
Yeah,
which really comes from a place of I don't want them to pick up something.
Yeah,
that either I didn't have, my parents wouldn't agree with necessarily, or whatever else. What I find interesting about that is, if in certain African countries, and not just in certain African countries, in certain African cities, and even in the city within certain communities, you can start to see evidence of an erosion of a value system that in that country or community would be called African. But you see that value system starting to erode, and then those parents getting worried about who are our children going to be.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? There's that fear. And I wonder, what if there's anything, what are you guys afraid of in terms for your children? What are you afraid of they'll be exposed to? Is there anything you're afraid of in terms of what then that would lead them to who they become? Or what are your fears about parenting?
I think, like I said, my kids are growing up in a house where I am African. My wife is African American. She's black. She's also a mixed race. She's black and white. So I think that for them, at some point, when they start exploring their own identity, that teen age will create some kind of instability for them, because they will be exploring and trying to figure out who they can identify as. which is good. But I think finding that stable identity would be easy for them as it was for me, because I was socialized in one and it was consistent. My dad was Luo, my mom is Luo, my family is Luo, and I live in Kenya. So I didn't have to think too hard about that, even if I was being told who I was. But for them, that navigation is going to be different, right? So if I'm an African who is navigating what it means to be African American, since I live here, and since my wife is Black and white, so they'll have this variety of perspectives to sift through. It could be that they want to belong to one of them, or they agree or disagree with another one, or they want to combine them. But it's obviously not going to be the easy process that perhaps I had for good or bad reasons. So this will probably hit them later, maybe in a subconscious way, when they are sort of trying to explain why they behave the way they behave, um, and they're trying to explain their conscious behaviors and make sense of their preferences and practices and perspectives, who they want to hang out with, what they want to eat, where they want to go. So they don't really have to choose one of them. They may have to grapple with them, but certainly that process of navigating and creating that mixed identity is not the easiest one. And so it's not necessarily a fear more, but a fear for them, for the challenge they will face in trying to, and maybe to say it bluntly, Mike, is to fear that identity crisis that they may have at some point, and how they will deal with that identity crisis.
For me, it's the fear that I feel like when it comes to my children's identity, it's easier as far as like who you are and where you come from, because Ben and I are South Sudanese. We're both Dinka. We're from same area, same village, so it's easier for that sense. I think my worry is that they won't really know Africa unless we're able to take them to Africa and even be there for a while, because we're not as integrated where we live now. There's not a lot of South Sudanese people that live where we are. And so when it comes to some of the cultural practices, the connectivity, even things like Levy, you're saying, having many people live in the house, that's something we grew up with. Even here in the US, my relatives would show up from across the country and show up to our house, and they're there for the next 6 months and we didn't know, you know. So like that is a norm that I definitely don't see myself practicing, so that my kids can know that, because I don't personally want that. But I think about the fact that some of those experiences of what makes us who we are, or makes us very African, are things that we really didn't have much control over, right? Who stayed with us, how we communicated with elders and all that. Part of that happened because they were in our environment. My worry is that they're not in that environment to learn it organically. So, what I teach them, it's almost like teaching them out of a textbook, but they don't get to live the experience. And so I think I need to be comfortable with the fact that who they are African, as an African living in America, being raised in America from the ground up, is going to be drastically different from the African that I am, or the identity that I have. And I need to be okay with that, because there's not much that I can control in that sense. My ideal situation is I would love to be able to raise my children in both places. Financially, that's not possible. But I would like to be able to give them some of those experiences, and connecting with relatives, hearing the different languages and dialects that go on in our countries. And for me, even more specifically, it's not even possible to raise them, say, in South Sudan because of the insecurity, but I still want them to know Pan Africa. I want them to know Africa in general. So a big part of me, and I always joke about it with my husband every now and then, I'm like, we need to just move back, just take the kids for a few years. Especially, I feel like these early formative years are the times to really get them out there. And then, when you go, if they come back here for middle school, high school, college, you have some grounding. You still growing and learning what it means to be African, but at least you have some experiences under the belt. There's something organic about being on the continent and really experiencing life as an African versus like reading about it in a book. Like, I don't know, or hearing about it from family. There's a nostalgia there, and I hear my son, his face lights up when we're talking about Africa, but because to him it's some foreign land he hasn't experienced yet. And I don't know how we're going to do that at all.
Yeah, and it's interesting I like the way you put it. Their search for their identity, whatever it means to be African to them, is going to different than yours, right? And that happens just because of the passage of time, right? Cultures don't remain static, identities don't remain static. They tend to have a few things that remain their core, but then they can be expressed differently without necessarily now having to get another label. That you're not this. But I just listening to the both of you, I wonder how much of your parenting journey involved learning about yourself, or maybe reflecting on yourself.
I would say, connecting it to children, I think up to the point before I became a parent, I was operating subconsciously. To a large extent, subconsciousness was driving my preferences, my choice, my views. But when kids came, I feel like they reflected a mirror on me in terms of who I am, how I behave, how I discipline, what triggers me, what I try to push to them. And it kind of forced me to sit back and ask, who am I? Why do these things bother me? Why do I push these things to them? Why do I want them to grow up this way? Why do they? So I think it was a blessing in some sense, because it forced me to actually uncover and discover myself in that subconscious that was there, that was driving things that I wanted and how I wanted to raise them, and to sit with that. And I think it's still a process even today, to uncover and in some sense even realize that some influences from my dad shaped who I was and what I preferred. My mom shaped who I was, what I preferred, and to sift through that and to think in terms of what would I want to move forward with, and how do I want to continue navigating this new context and find out who I can become, who I was. So parenting to me has been a blessing in that sense. It's been like the kids have been a mirror to me in terms of, in many, many ways. I've been a sounding board in many ways. I've been a mirror. Sometimes Linda, sometimes you discipline them and you spend hours agonizing why you did it.
Yes.
You feel like you should go and give them 100 kisses and hugs and buy them toys. You're like, oh God, why did I do that? Why did I say that?
Yes.
So, so there's
now
that.
let me ask you this. Sorry to interrupt, but do you think that's what your dad was thinking sometimes? You think he was thinking, man, I really want to go give Levy 100 kisses, man.
I don't think so.
Sometimes. I think sometimes. Sometimes I would notice the feeling of regret. Like, a kid can know it too. I would notice that feeling of, you want to watch TV?
Yes.
Like, where is that coming from? Like, why all of a sudden should I want?
Yes, it's like that. I remember, you just made me think about times when my mom would discipline me and then she'd be like, oh, are you hungry? And it's like, what? It's like they go back to like, they don't say sorry or
No.
I feel bad, but it's like, oh, let me be sweeter to you than I just was. That's pretty much it.
Right.
That's it. That's like
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, that was the tone for I'm sorry. And it's funny because, I'm sure, Levy, you and I both are very similar. So I'm sure you've read parenting books and how to, all this stuff. And so like, I know what I should do in the situation. But, my upbringing tells me otherwise. So,
I think it's right.
Yes, I think it's right. And it's funny because Jacob and I struggle with this because I know when we're disciplining our boys, first we really try the American method, right? In our eyes, it's the American method. It's probably the psychological, pediatrician approved method. But for us, it's the American method. It's like, okay, we'll put him in timeout. Then we get to a limit and we're like, just that's it. We're done. Let's go back to our roots. We know this works. And it's funny. You're right. When you reflect back later, you're just like, man, I know just ain't good. I don't want to raise my children out of fear, but God, sometimes you need them to be afraid of you. And at the same time, I think about how similar they are to us and how some of their behaviors, I remember why I would behave that certain way. And, when you're reflecting back and you're kind of going, okay, I think he just has an insecurity, or maybe he didn't feel like he was heard. And that's why he kept talking to us, is just talking back. But maybe he just felt like we're not hearing him out, and am I teaching him not to voice his opinion and concern? And then later on, I'm going to be like, you voice your opinion, your concern, you matter, all this stuff. But it's like, but I've been teaching him the opposite of that at the same time. So it's like, I struggle with that too, because you need them to understand respect.
Yeah.
And I know I should take the time to show them how to speak up for themselves versus just going, that was wrong, I'm going to discipline you. And they take that as a blanket statement to mean that they shouldn't be talking at all.
I think there's a sweet spot somewhere. And I think parenting is navigating and finding it over time.
And it's
hard. No perfect parent, actually.
There's none. And I think we just want to get away with the minimal damage at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all we can strive for.
Cross your fingers for the rest. But that's the way I mean, I'm not a parent, but conceptually, and I think it's okay for me to sound ignorant because I've not been a parent. But conceptually, the way I think about parenting is you have a white canvas, which is their future, who they are in the future. And as a parent, you're just throwing things in a bucket, different colors of paint. And then eventually you throw it on this bucket on this white canvas, and whatever mismatch of things comes out. Because the environment is
God's plan.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever comes out of that, that's what happens. Because, like you're saying, sometimes muting certain things about your child could end up being a handicap for them, because then they don't leverage some of the things that they have within them to then be successful in whatever it is. Like, even, I think about, if the Sims, just pick on the education system, okay, and sometimes reflecting back, I remember how if you didn't, like the teacher, if you didn't say what they wanted to hear, you were going to get punished, right? So even that part of the learning where you get to walk through a thought process wasn't encouraged, right? Either you knew the answer or you didn't, but you sit there and think, maybe if I do this, and this, and you're at the board, right? It's not something that is welcoming, but maybe that could be something that the society is telling you have to be an accountant. But maybe that part of you, maybe that part of your creativity or whatever it was, could have helped to become a better accountant, so you still fitted within whatever predictive career choice that the society was telling you to go to. But at least you had this extra things within you that also nurtured, that make you be successful in whatever it is that you're doing. So, but anyway, two more questions. One, to both of you. Linda, what have you learned about being a father? And Levy, what have you learned about being a mother?
I think what I've learned is that we're similar. We have two different approaches to raising the children, but I think we have the same goal in mind. And so, and more importantly for me, the father is just as important as the mother. Growing up in Africa, you oftentimes have the mother more present than the father. But I've learned, having had that model, how important a father is. They both can affirm and strengthen and help you form your identity. And I think that's very important. And so I feel like the father needs to be as present as much as the mother.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this question, and I think it made me think a lot about many things. I think for me, I find when I look at my wife, and I'll talk about it from the standpoint of my wife, because at least as the mother, and of course I know my mother, but my wife, whoever I relate to so closely, I think it's, and Linda may relate to some of this, I think it's motherhood, first of all, is strongly shaped by experiences of carrying children in the womb that has a strong effect on the ways mothers relate to their children. It's powerful. For example, there's a naturally possessive sense that I don't naturally have and have to work on from the moment of birth. Again, that motherhood shapes how my wife interprets her experiences in different domains and how she navigates the world. For instance, it shapes what work means for her and how she would like to use her time. It's so overarching, and it provides a deep sense of meaning to her that brings a sense of well-being and accomplishment that mostly nothing else does. And if I can tune with that, then I can know what's giving her well-being and create time for her to achieve that well-being. But interestingly, sometimes I think it can also constrain her in terms of navigation of the world, because it can almost have this gravitational force on her. And I think for women generally, in the sense that it holds them from exploring who they can be in the world. My wife likes to talk about a book she's read where she says sometimes she realizes she has to let me be the father so she can actually allow me to be the father so she can explore. Otherwise, she'll be there day and night, weekend, exploring and trying to be this mother she wants to be. And I think it, to me, then when she does that, it brings this meaningful perspective on life that transcends just living for a career, right? So when I acutely tune in into the way that she engages with the world and what she sees, I see a world that's easy for me to miss. For example, um, she likes being with the children a lot, like naturally. She appreciates them, not that I don't, but the way she appreciates them, if I'm in tune, I notice is really different. And that strong sense of possession that I was telling you, that natural one, is influenced by the fact that she carried them for 9 months. So her relationship started with them a long time ago. They've been relating for 9 months. I started relating later after 9 months. So I probably jumped in later after 9 months of relationship, the kicking and everything. And she marvels about them in ways that I sometimes am unable to, and reintroduces them to me too in more meaningful and powerful ways that I forget. For instance, one time she was thinking of looking at this picture. What is it called? The picture you take when you're being scanned.
The sonogram.
Yeah, and she was looking at it and thinking about how they were like gummy bears in their belly, in her belly, and thinking about how they would move in her belly and kick. And that relationship, she articulates it so clearly. And then she looks at them now and she thinks of how they're big and they can kick a ball so hard. Me, I'm just thinking, oh, look at how he can kick a ball. She's thinking about that kick differently from where it started. Than me, I'm thinking about the kick now that I taught her. I taught the son, but she's thinking, oh, he was kicking like that a long time ago. So that spectrum can be really hard for me to see, because my natural tendency is to see the spectrum from the point at which they were born, from the point at which they came out of the womb. So I think the perspective that my wife takes on the children has given me a strong sense of being for me as a father. It's almost like I depend on that perspective sometimes to get a stronger sense of who I should be as a father. So it's really valuable for me in that sense.
You said something really important, Levy, about learning how your wife relates to the kids, or how she connects with them. I find that I'm always encouraging my husband to spend more time with the kids, because I find we're both working individuals, and when we spend dedicated time doing something with our kids, it helps us kind of recharge, and it helps us really understand ourselves a little bit better. For some reason, it just does. When I spend time with my kids and I hear them trying to chew through an idea or understand what's going on in the world, it helps me kind of realize, how I think and how I process things. And I carry that back to my work. Like, it really does matter. And so when I think about how many, the important role of fathers being with the kids, I think about the fact that, we grow up with some societies where the father needs to just constantly be working and only dealing with adult things. But there's something about interacting with children, and especially your own children, that helps you feel a little more grounded, more centered, and it re-energizes your purpose for life in a sense, and I think that is something that's very important for both parents to have, and to be able to connect with their children with.
Well, Levy, I know you have to go. So, Linda, I want to read something to you and then just respond in closing and just respond however you feel. This is about parenting, right? It's from a book. Person is giving advice on their perspective of parenting. So, and this is what they say. They say that you have to first raise a child in you that needed or longed for something, so that you can actually parent the child in front of you and not the child you imagine in your child.
Mm.
So you have to first raise the child in you that needed or longed for something, so that you can actually parent the child in front of you and not the child you imagine in your child.
Mm.
Can I just say 2 minutes and then run? So I like that question a lot, and I think it goes back to my point about the mirror. And I think that when I see my kids, they remind me of my very raw human sense, that is very raw and can be very mature and can be very uninformed and unknowledgeable, and can be very unknowledgeable about the world that I live in. And them reflecting that to me gets me to see all my flaws, all my inabilities, all my incapacities, or my lack of wisdom, and so many things I don't see in how I behave, my irrational sense, my, just that sense of a very simple, raw version of myself that can be sometimes forgotten. And when I get to tap into that and I reflect on that and I realize that I need to grow, and that's where I realize that this journey is for me and my son,
Mm-hmm.
that this journey is for me and my sons, that we're on this journey together. That in me you reflect that I need to actually develop. I need to be developing it as I help you to develop your own. So, like even that example of acting just irrationally, things that I want out of no reason, things that make me annoyed, things that have nothing to do with my executive control, things that are just subconscious. That reflection, when I sit back and I realize that was childish. And childish in a sense that I can nurture it and grow it, but I need them to reflect that and then realize, you know what, you and I are walking this journey. You and a child, you're a child, and I have an internal one that needs to be grown in this world that's as new to you as it's new to me. Because the world is new every day. The world is new every month. And if we are naive, we don't realize how new it is every time. And so we are just all being exposed to a new world, just like the children are being exposed.
Mm-hmm. I think that quote for me reminds me that I need to look at my inner child, and the things that I want that inner child to be able to do or to grow into are the things that I need to reflect of raising my child, because I think it's easy to raise our children to be this idealistic person, you know, way more than we could even ask of ourselves, because we do every day. When I'm asking my children to do something, I'm expecting so much more of them than I would ever expect of myself. And I think it's important. What that quote reminds me of is the importance of understanding myself and my limitations and abilities, and then making sure that I'm not projecting my children to do more than that first. Not expecting more than I would expect of myself in their position. And I think of this when it comes to my older son. He's very he's very inquisitive, and he also has good confidence in himself. So he feels like when he knows something, he'll just go for it. You know, he'll say it and go for it. And if he is told he's wrong, he really internalizes it, and it kind of shuts him down. And every time I see him do that, I think of myself and how I tend to do that. You know, when I feel confident in something, I present it forward. And then if it's shut down, it's going to be really hard for me to try again, because I feel like, okay, maybe I didn't get it. Maybe I wasn't that smart. And it made me realize that, you know, while he's projecting this confidence, that confidence is still like predicated on acceptance of his idea. And so you know, teaching him to accept the feedback not as a shutdown, but as a way to refine what he presented, you know, and bring it back up. And that, because that's something that I struggle with in myself, especially in work. You know, when I produce something, I think it's great, I hand it forward, and whenever there's some criticism of it, it's easy for me to be like, oh, they didn't like it, you know. But it's more important for me to go, okay, they're giving me pointers on how I can make it better, you know. And so now, because I've learned that about myself, I'm working towards that, then I can teach my child from an early age how to replicate that in a meaningful way for him, that eventually when he's my age or working and whatever he's doing, he has had more practice than I have to building that and being more comfortable with that kind of feedback, you know, and not internalizing it and causing himself to shut down and to shut off that creative ability that he has, you know. And so that's what that quote really reminded me of.
Giving him the tools.
Yeah.
Man, it's such a personal thing.
Yes, it is.
Well, it's both made me look forward to parenting, but also appreciate how
healthy
complex.
fear of it?
Yeah, exactly. it's like both things at the same time. You know, it's like, man, that's us, but then you know, it was a good thing.
Yeah.
So man, that's awesome. But I think, first of all, I commend you guys for going down this journey. Everything that you're saying in just how I interact with you guys does not reflect like the challenges. You guys look like you are making it easy, right? It looks like you got this, and you know, you're just over there like doing everything, making sure everything is right. And
we need to restart this podcast then.
No, just not necessarily like just in talking to you guys, like just make it look easy. And but it's great that you're able to share, you know, all the different dimensions of parenting. And it's kind of conversations like this that I think are healthy for whether, you know, parents will hear this or folks who don't have kids will hear this, because I think it gives in depth, but also like just a multifaceted look at the experience from the perspective of the parent as a parent, but then also as sort of the parent as the individual reflecting on their own experiences of parenting. So it's been interesting. I appreciate you sharing.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. It was
good.
good.
Man.
It's good reflecting.
Man, parenting is, and you know, it as an, like I said, you know, I play the role of uncle. And for me, I try to be the best uncle, right?
Yeah.
So I have a competition with my brothers, and you know, we try to be the favorite uncle for our you know, our nephews and nieces. And from that perspective, it looks like something you can figure out, right? You know, when your uncle, you look at me like, oh, okay, you know, I can figure this out. I got them this that they liked. I got them that they liked. You know, every day, you know, I can direct them, and you talk to them every once in a while, listening to what they're going through, and reinforcing some things. You doing your homework? Are you this? Yes. And it feels like a checkbox of things that you can just do, and you know, they follow, right?
Yes. That is definitely not what the parents are dealing with.
Right. Man,
it's funny because my sister, she spends a lot of time with us, and so she sees this stuff. And whenever we have one of those chaotic days, she's just like, boy, this is some good birth control right here. Some days she's just like, it is pure chaos. Like when you have meltdowns and just misunderstandings all over the place, and we're just like, I gotta breathe. You go breathe. You go breathe. It's tough. It is tough work. It is sometimes thankless work, and you think about it. It's funny because when you reflect on it, you got all this joy and bubbliness and all that. But when you're going through it, it is definitely like walking through the fire. Well, when you talk to people, they're like, "Yeah, it's tough, it's crazy, yeah." But you're talking because you've been on the other side of the fire, know. But it is definitely tough. It is very. I think the biggest part of it is just self-discovery. You discover yourself on a whole nother level. It's the vulnerability, and it's also just the time-consuming nature of it. And you just can't escape it, at the same time. So it's like you might be able to escape it for periods of time, for hours at a time, or if you get away for a weekend or something. But even when you're away, you're thinking about the family, at the same time. Like you want to get back to them, but when you're with them, you're like, I want to get away. It's the back and forth. But it is something really unique, and I think if you dig into it, thinking about it as a self-discovering journey, kind of like relationships too. You get into a relationship. People go into relationships and they're thinking, okay, I'm going to settle in. This person likes me for me. I like them for them. And then you change, I think to be human is change. You're constantly changing, and the other people in your life kind of force change out of you. And only people that find it hard and frustrating and not enjoyable are people that don't want to change. But if you go into it knowing that change is gonna happen, change is gonna be a result of this, and you embrace it, it's a little bit easier to get through. Then it becomes kind of like a journey, right? It's a journey towards discovering and fulfillment, and so it's different. But when you go into it going, okay, this is the end all be all, that's different. So like, as long as you go into having children, like, okay, it's a journey that we don't even know where it's going. So let's just get into it. Go with it. It's different. Your approach matters. I've had friends who really struggle with the idea of a family or raising children because to them, they're so stuck in what they felt like it should be versus it being like, let's discover, let's figure it out. Even down to like what they want their kids to do. It's like, you could design what you want them to do. They might not want to do it. But if it's a discovery together, it's kind of like, well, what do you want to do? What activities do you want to get into? Whatever. And so like for me, I'm definitely taking that approach. I'm going, all right, we're going to do music. What music lesson do you want? Do you want to do vocals? Do you want to do an instrument? What are your choices? What do you want to do? You don't have to commit to it forever, but you need to commit to it for at least 6 weeks. Or something like that. And so it helps when you go into it that way, it helps you kind of deal with the possible changes and the hard times, the ups and the downs, So that's kind of what it becomes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's been really eye-opening. I could keep going and asking you more, but
but we all got stuff to do, right?
Yeah. But we hope invite the audience to participate. And, if you have comments and anything, please share them. If not, we will see you next week.
Join us for the next episode of All Things Africa with Levy, Mike, and Linda. To get instant notifications on new episodes, subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to our podcast, or find us on Anchor at anchor.fm/allthingsafrica. Follow us on Twitter and keep the conversation going with the hashtag AllThingsAfrica.